To change anything, you can only rely on yourself.
Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and on today's episode of CN Unit Analysis, we are finally going through Sunday, right? We have seen from the previous early access review, we have went through more than 40 minutes of Sunday's guides, tips and tricks, how do you play him, how do you use him, his builds, light cones, Eidolon, team comps, etc. So it went through very in-depth with regards to how Sunday is going to be working. As of this time of this recording, Sunday is going to be releasing on all servers very soon, so I'll be looking forward to play him myself personally on the live server. But just for today, I kind of want to go through a couple of additional pointers that CN community has brought up, which may or may not benefit your own account, right? So without further ado, let's get into today's content.
Subscribe!
So for the abilities, kits, skills, etc., I'm not going to be going through them here anymore. You want to take a look, you can feel free to take a look at the early access review. But I kind of want to go through a couple of additional pointers that will probably be quite helpful with regards to the general playability and comfort with for Sunday, right? So first things first, for the additional info regarding Sunday's kit, if you kind of want to summarize them all together, you can take a look as you can see on the screen, right? So TLDR, you will always get a turn 1 ultimate if you were to equip him with energy regeneration rope because of the traits that gives him 25 energy at the start of battle. For his ultimate, and if we are going to be assuming a minimum 3-turn ultimate, we are going to be aiming for 20% of the maximum energy for any of the DPS. Note that this 20% of this maximum energy, it will be default to 40 for every single DPS except Jingliu at 48. So everybody's at 40, Jingliu's at 48. So in the future, if there's going to be another DPS that has a higher maximum energy than 200, because even Argenti, his maximum energy is 180, then Sunday's value would be very strong. We could see summon DPS getting a very high ultimate cost as well, and which in that case, Sunday's energy buff is going to be extremely potent, right? Then aside from that, the ultimate also gives us a roughly 60 to 90% of crit damage buff on top of the energy regeneration, but you can kind of aim this to be around the 70% to 80% ballpark for players with a decent build Sunday, since you are going to be building a slow Sunday most of the time with a pretty decent crit damage substats, right? Then for Sunday's skill, you allow both the character and the summons to instantly take action. 80% damage buff for both the target as well as the summons if they have a summon. If they do not have a summon, that's only going to be a 30% damage buff with a 20% pretty much permanent crit rate buff, as well as the fact that in the current format, if we are going to be running an E0S1, he is essentially skill point positive, generating 2 skill points every 3 turns, or maybe even 2 skill points every 2 turns if you can achieve a 2-turn ultimate. So specifically for the 100% action value advance, it is not really aimed at just Bronya and Sunday, preventing both of them from buffing each other. It is more so to prevent Sunday from pulling up Robin in the practical applications, right? Because you have seen from Sparkle as well as Bronya, there are some scenarios where you could actually use them to pull up Robin and let Robin cast an additional basic or an additional skill just to get the additional energy required to cast another Robin ultimate. So unfortunately, Sunday would not be able to do this with Robin, so something for you guys to keep in mind. So that is the summary of what Sunday does, as well as some additional notes. Once again, if you want to take a look at the in-depth one, feel free to look at the early access review, and I'm now just going to jump into the energy rotations. So as you can see from this table here, we can guarantee a 3-turn ultimate for quite a couple of scenarios, and frankly speaking, Sunday achieving a 3-turn ultimate, at least in CN's perspective, is almost non-negotiable. There's no such thing, or rather 4-turn ultimate Sunday is not something that they are going to be factoring into their theory crafting. So almost every single practical combat scenarios, you will want to try to hit that 3-turn Sunday ultimate as much as can humanly possible, especially with the signature light cone, but you can still achieve this without it. So the first of all is going to be very straightforward. With the S1, you are essentially guaranteed 3-turn ultimate, no questions asked. And then if you do not have his signature light cone, then if you want to use Bronya's S1, you will need to get hit 1 time in order to regenerate the 3-turn ultimate rotation. So you still need to get hit. If you do have a S3 Bronya signature, you also guaranteed 3-turn ultimate, so very nice. Otherwise, these are basically for whales. If you have a E4 S1 Sunday, specifically the E4, you can actually try to maintain a 2-turn ultimate rotation, which can be quite interesting to see because you are essentially gaining 2 skill points every 2 turns, especially the signature, and you are more than 100% coverage on your buff uptime, on top of the fact that this energy regeneration can also be a lot more beneficial for your DPS, right? Keep in mind, speaking of 2-turn ultimate rotations, this is also something that CN have been thinking about, which is a 2-turn ultimate Sunday. So if you are going to be running a signature light cone, you still need to get 22 additional energy. So all the numbers here you basically see, they are the additional energy that you would need in order to make Sunday achieve a 2-turn ultimate. So 22 energy for S1, 32 for S1 Bronya, 29 for S3 Bronya, and 6 energy if you have a E4 S1 Sunday. If you have a E4 S5 Sunday, you are guaranteed a 2-turn ultimate, which is quite diabolical. So whether or not you get this additional energy, it depends on different factors, right? You can run Quick Pokke, Gallagher, you can run Quick Pokke, Huan. You can run a 3-star Lycon such as Fine Fruit. You can also rely on the chance of RNG getting hit, right? So quite a lot of different ways if you want to achieve these different energy deficits. But once you achieve them, you can consider getting yourself a 2-turn ultimate with Sunday, but not really that recommended, especially for players with a Bronya signature, more so for players who manage to pull for Sunday's signature Lycon, right? So that's going to be that for its energy rotations. Now with the energy rotation out of the way, let's just talk about Sunday's speed tuning. As mentioned in the early access review, you basically have 2 different builds for Sunday. The hyper speed Sunday, which is going to be 160 speed and above, or the slow Sunday where you run a 134 DPS with a 133.4 Sunday itself, right? So I'm just going to list out this DPS. So for fast Sunday pairing, you are going to be running most of the time Boot Hill, DPS Lingsha, Yunli, Clara, or any extremely fast or extremely slow DPS that are going to be coming out in the future. So for almost every other DPS, you are going to be running them the slow Sunday setup, such as Scylla, Jing Yuan, Topaz, Jingliu, Blade, Imbibitor Lunae, Acheron, Feixiao, etc. Almost all of these DPS, you would stand to benefit if you just build them a little bit faster and make Sunday a little bit slower. So in summary, if a unit can achieve a very fast speed without sacrificing too much damage, it is almost always worth it to run slow Sunday in order to improve our DPS rotations because of higher energy regeneration. Since if your DPS X one more time, that means you can generate more energy from either even a basic or a skill, right? As well as the fact that because Sunday's buffs for your skill, tracers, talents, ultimate, they all last either 2 turns or 3 turns, which means that running a 135 DPS, 134 Sunday, you are still getting 100% gut buff coverage, which is not something that you can do last time with both Bronya and Sparkle, right? So TLDR slow Sunday is always going to be very, very nice. This will only change if there are more speed extremes DPS that are introduced. So this is either break DPS most of the time, because break DPS you only want your speed subs with your break event subs, that's right. Or an extremely slow DPS who wants to just all-in crit and they don't really gain a lot of value from getting additional turns, such as Yunli, Clara, or any slow DPS in the future, right? So generally speaking, TLDR Sunday at a slow build would suffice for majority of the player base running majority of the team comps with majority of the DPS. So with regards to Sunday's signature Litecoin Eidolons, for signature Litecoin, both Ian and CM pretty much feel the same thing. His signature Litecoin is extremely comfortable, and it is highly recommended to pull for the S1 before the E1, just because of the skill point positivity, especially if you want to kind of prepare for the future summons meta. If the summon DPS, they are going to be quite skill point intensive, then running this signature Litecoin would definitely help a lot, because it basically turns Sunday from a skill point negative support to a skill point positive support, right? So very comfortable signature Litecoin, just purely for the rotation for the energy, rotation for the skill points, as well as the fact that the 45% damage buff is a nice touch, but it is really not the most important thing. Just an extremely comfortable Litecoin to have, right? You can also start to consider a 2-turn ultimate rotations with Sunday signature Litecoin, which can be a little bit difficult to achieve if you are going to be running Bronya signature Litecoin, right? So that is going to be that. And jumping into the items, you can just see the numbers over here. For a Sunday's E1 is essentially 60% defense ignored for our main DPS, but our summons are going to be ignoring 40% of our defense, right? So for Jing Yuan, this roughly translates to a 19% final damage increase, and then for a E0 S1 Feixiao is a 12.5%. For Acheron with Jiao Qiu, that's going to be roughly 9.3%, but for Acheron with Pella, that's going to be going up at 14.4% because defense reduction does that quite exponentially. So generally speaking, Sunday's Eidolon 1 is also a very good value. Not to say it's very bad compared to Signature Litecoin, because in the future, if we get more summon DPS, more defense down sources, this defense down, especially 40% defense down for your summon DPS, it can be extremely powerful to stack on our damage exponentially for any of our summon racks. So that's going to be that for the E1. Then for the E2, frankly speaking, this doesn't really change anything. So these 2 skill points, most of the time you don't really care about it that much. And then for a 30% damage buff is roughly translates to a 8.6% final damage increase for Jing Yuan. So more or less a comfort Eidolon just for the additional skill points, but otherwise this E2 is still more or less okay, nothing too impressive. E4 Sunday, that's where something I brought up just now in the energy rotation segment, which is you can start to look into a 2-turn ultimate Sunday rotation if you want to pull all the way to E4. So once you reach E4 S1, you basically just need another 6 energy. So this can be either through getting hit, quick Pokke, etc. And Sunday will maintain a 2-turn ultimate rotation. It is not a must to get an E4 because you can still get a 2-turn ultimate if you run things like Huo with quick Pokke as well as all of the other sources all getting hit, right? So not really a must, but for players that are really not relying their fate to RNG, you could consider getting an E4. Otherwise, you also need to get the E4 S5 in order to have 100% no RNG whatsoever. So generally speaking, I probably say that E4 S5 is not that worth it just to maintain a 2-turn ultimate, which kind of jumps into our E6 because most people pull the E4 just for the E6, right? Sunday's E6 essentially converts crit rate to crit damage, right? Any excess crit rate to crit damage. So if you were to convert this to a additional 80% crit damage, which means you have 40% additional crit rate, this is a roughly 20% final damage increase. If you are converting 50% crit rate, which is going to be 100 crit damage, this is going to be a roughly 25% damage increase. So overall, the numbers for Sunday's E6 is nothing too insane compared to a couple of our other supports like Robin's E6, Sparkle's E6, or even Rame's E6. The damage goes up by a lot higher than just 20%. Usually it's around the 30 to 40% range for the E6, right? Especially for E6 support. So at this point, generally speaking, E1 S1 Sunday is probably the most bang for a buck if you want to consider pulling for both his Eidolons and Signature Lycon. Otherwise, E0 S1 Sunday is a very good stopping point. E0 S0, if you have a Bronya signature, is not going to be that bad, but you are definitely going to be facing into some slight skill point problems, so do take that into considerations. Alright, now finally going into Sunday's team comp, we are definitely going to dive into this a little bit further because I do intend to do something like a before you pull Sunday, where I'm going to be doing him with every single DPS, and before you skip Jing Yuan, which is basically pairing up Sunday with Jing Yuan and see how he performs in the 3 endgame content. But this is going to be the rough summary if we are going to be running Sunday with this setup, right? So pros to Sunday is essentially a very well-rounded hyper carry support with very good numbers in his base kill alone, with his crit rate, crit damage, damage buff, energy regeneration, etc. It is a very well-rounded support. The downside is that for almost every single setup, like I mentioned just now, you would need your main DPS to hit 134 speed, and then your Sunday is going to be at 133.4 speed, which means that you would need to adjust your relics to fit this specific criteria because you are no longer going to be pairing him with like a DPS with a Sparkle, because for that, your DPS can still run attack boost and Sparkle can just go as fast as you can, right? Also, since Sunday does have a 20% crit rate buff, factor in that 20% crit rate into your DPS as well. So generally speaking, if you are running a build that is like a 85% or 90% DPS with like 180% crit damage, you would need to probably sacrifice some crit rate just to give it even more crit damage because of this additional 20% crit rate, which might be a little bit uncomfortable if you're constantly swapping in and out between using Sunday with the DPS or not using Sunday with the DPS, right? So aside from that, let's just talk about the big boys themselves. The best in slot, or rather the DPS that stands to gain the absolute highest benefit, is going to be Jing Yuan, bar none, right? He is the most valuable DPS with regards to Sunday as of this current moment, because he essentially transforms Jing Yuan from like a tier 2 DPS to almost a tier 0.5 or perhaps even tier 0 DPS, right? So very strong damage increase. Aside from that, Argenti is a pretty decent alternative with regards to the buffs because he also basically takes every single buff that Sunday provides to him, right? The energy buff, crit rate, crit damage, damage buff. Argenti can take everything, it's just that the summons portion is not going to be that impressive. Then aside from Jing Yuan and Argenti, the rest of the DPS, there are some flaws, or rather some mismatch between their kit and Sunday's kit. So for example, Jingliu and Blade, although they are also very synergistic, both Jingliu and Blade, even if you run them with a crit damage his chest, most of the time you are still probably get a pretty high amount of crit rate overflow. So for example, Jingliu herself already has a massive 50% free crit rate, and for Blade, if you're running 4-piece Longevous, that's going to be another 16% crit rate. Or if you're going to be pulling for like even like E2 Blade, etc., his crit rate generally is quite high, especially considering his free crit rate traces, right? So you might see a little bit of crit rate overflow, but it could be fixed with your crit damage subsets, so not the end of the road. For Jingliu or even Kelala over here, their base speed is way too low, so it is not going to be ideal for them to stack on all-in speed, because that means you have to sacrifice way too much. For example, your attack percentage boost is gone, your crit and crit damage subsets are also gone, just for the sake of achieving a 134 speed on your main DPS. Not to mention for Yuni and Clara, their damage mostly come from counters, so sacrificing this much speed to make them go faster, it will inevitably reduce their counter damage as well, and that's gonna be the key damage proponent coming from both Yuni and Kelala, right? So if you are gonna be doing that, it might not be the absolute most ideal scenario, so you probably still want to stick this with a hyper speed Sunday, but that means you need to adjust the relics once again, right? Aside from that, Feixiao and Acheron, they are also essentially our version 2.0 DPS. They don't really benefit at all from Sunday's energy regeneration, but if you don't give them Sunday's ultimate, that means they are going to be losing quite a bit of crit damage, right? It's roughly on average 70 to 80% crit damage, so that's going to be depending if you value that as well. Aside from that, they also have a lot of other potential supports that they have. So Jiao Qiu is already there with Acheron, Robin is already there with Feixiao, aside from Han March 7 as well as Topaz. So it is not to say unusable, but there are probably more users you can fit Sunday in instead of Acheron and Feixiao. And then finally, for your break DPS, Rappa, Boothill, and Firefly, or if you want to consider DPS Lingsha, none of them really gain any benefits from Sunday's kit aside from the additional turn, right? So for your damage buff, crit damage buff, they are mostly useless. For Firefly, she also doesn't really care about the additional 20% max energy most of the time, since she's always going to be in the ultimate state, right? For Boothill and Rappa, the additional action value advance as well as the max energy, that could be quite useful. In fact, if you run a hyper speed Boothill with a hyper speed Sunday, you can get quite a lot of turns, which is essentially how you want to play Boothill with a old Bronya setup, right? So if you want to use Sunday with Boothill, you can also still use him as well, considering also Boothill does have some decent crit rate conversion in his traces, so you could still see some benefit, especially for Boothill. Then DPS Lingsha, you still want to build her as break, basically just give her as many actions as possible for both herself as well as Fu Yuan, right? So that's gonna be that. So in summary, this is going to be some of the team building opinions as well as maybe your pool considerations as to whether should you be pulling for Sunday according to CN, right? So for Jing Yuan, tier changing difference. So if you are a Jing Yuan main, no questions asked, you will probably almost definitely want to pull for Sunday. So this is gonna be what they found in their performance for all three endgame content for Jing Yuan specifically. Against a lightning weak stage, you are able to get a 2 to 3 turn. Against pure fiction second half, you can get a very comfortable 40,000 points. And then for Apocalyptic Shadow, it's gonna be at roughly 3,400 points. So it essentially means that with the help of Sunday, Jing Yuan can 3-star pretty much every single endgame content as we can see from this current moment, right? So and that's going to be a very exceptional increase in terms of Jing Yuan's performance. And then for Argenti, it's going to be a decent upgrade for his kit. So Sunday plus Robin plus Huo Huo, this is going to be a quote-unquote wheelchair unit. So this team, Sunday, Robin, and Huo Huo, you can basically run them with almost every single DPS setup. So Argenti is, you can kind of know him as like the wheelchair guy, because this wheelchair guy you can be pretty much in DPS, right? Also, pretty decent increase. It is gonna be more comfortable compared to Sparkle plus Robin, especially since Sparkle's ultimate buff, it is gonna run out during the start of Argenti's next turn. So if you want to save your energy, etc., want to wait for Argenti's turn to begin, then you are going to run out of the buffs. And from generally speaking, Sunday's buff coverage lasting 2 turns is just a lot more comfortable on top of the 20% energy regeneration, right? Which is going to be very crucial for Argenti, especially in pure fiction. And this is going to be a decent increase, but not too much. For Jingliu and Blade, their crit rate is really pretty high, so they can't really appreciate the 20% crit buff. And on top of that, their kit themselves doesn't gain a lot, since it's only going to be a 30% damage buff instead of 80% when both of them are not summoned DPS. So going to be a decent increase, but not too crazy. And this is going to be essentially almost no change. So if you're are gonna be, for example, if your Feixiao is already gonna be paired with Robin and a either Han Mark 7 of Topaz, or if you're gonna be an Acheron with already a Jiaoqiu and Pella, or if you're gonna be an E2S1 Acheron, then that almost no change. For Jingliu and Boothill, kind of the same thing. You will run Jingliu with Sparkle, Boothill with Bronya, or if you don't want to run Boothill with Bronya, you can run Harmony MC, etc. So generally speaking, these are gonna be DPSs that don't really have a very high increase, but you can essentially replace a E0S1 Sunday over a E2S1 Bronya or a E0S1 Sparkle. So this is in summary of some findings that the CN committee has found with regards to including Sunday into the DPS team or not into the DPS team. So I just kind of want to take a look a little bit more in depth with regards to the changes. First things first, taking a look at Jing Yuan, you can see that for Jing Yuan's build over here, we are taking a look at 136 speed with 82% crit rate and 130 crit damage. Now some might say that this crit damage is going to be very, very low, but in reality, if you combine this with Sunday as well as Robin, they can actually provide a extremely strong amount of crit damage buff, because both Robin and Sunday give a very, very high amount of crit damage themselves, right? So in order to sacrifice some substats, Jing Yuan would have to sacrifice their crit damage substats in order to funnel into a 137 or rather above 134 speed build, right? Also keep in mind that because we only need 70% crit rate on Jing Yuan, this will allow us to already hit 100% crit rate, because he does have a 10% crit rate from his tracers as well as 20% from Sunday. So honestly, this 82.9% crit rate is just a little bit too high, so it would be more ideal if you slot this a little bit into crit damage, but I digress, right? In the actual performance, so these are gonna be the rough distribution of Jing Yuan's damage output. So 23% of the damage is gonna come from his skill, 22.2% from the ultimate, and 54.8% from Lightning Lord itself, right? So generally speaking, most of Jing Yuan's damage are still coming from Lightning Lord, but do take in mind that skill and ultimate would take a slightly under half of his total damage distribution. From the testing this CM player found, especially against MOC 12 Sarok, is that we are able to quite reliably clear this within 2 to 3 cycles, especially considering the MOC buff, right? So with the help of Sunday, unfortunately, you can't cleanse Jing Yuan. So that is something that you will need to keep in mind. If Sarok or any sort of crowd controls that are like Sarok's 10, then Sunday would not be able to buff Jing Yuan or rather dispel him from this situation, as well as the fact that if we are considering Sarok's action value delay from his beam attack, it can be a little bit annoying because it will completely mess up our speed order, right? So you definitely need a couple of reasons. You can see over here, if Sarok does this, and if it actually does an action value delay, it would not be too good, but luckily for us, this didn't affect us in the grand scheme of things, right? So if it will affect your speed tuning, then that's going to be quite bad for the setup, but overall, still a very, very nice increase in Jing Yuan's overall performance, right? So that is going to be that. Now we want to kind of compare this with Feixiao, with a E0S1 Feixiao plus a E0S0 Sunday versus E2S1 Bronya. So at an E2S1 Bronya perspective, Bronya actually does a little bit better, roughly 8.37% better than a E0S0 Sunday, right? So just something for you guys to keep in mind, with the teammates being an E0S0 Robin as well as a Aventurine with Japard's signature light code. Now the main reason why E2S1 Bronya is still going to be performing honestly quite a bit better compared to E0S0 Sunday is because Feixiao's kit is not really reliant that much on the buff's coverage, because most of Feixiao's damage are going to be coming from Feixiao's ultimate, right? So you could honestly save Feixiao's ultimate all the way up to 12 stacks and then line that up with Bronya's ultimate, Bronya's skill, and then let go of Feixiao's ultimate. So with this case, Bronya's ultimate values as well as her overall buff values actually have a very, very high amount of mileage for Feixiao herself, since she gets the full benefits even without a 100% buff coverage. So she doesn't really rely that much on Sunday having a permanent buff uptime. Feixiao would rather have a higher buff value but a shorter buff uptime, since you can kind of condense all of the ultimate into a single turn with the help of the Bronya's buff, etc. So this is going to be a summary. A E2S1 Bronya is going to be better than an E0S0 Sunday, but an E0S0 Sunday is going to be better than an E1S1 Bronya. If Sunday can basically balance out the crit values, especially the crit values that Bronya provide, then E2S1 Bronya is going to be equivalent to E0S0 Sunday, right? So that's going to be for your consideration. Now, talking about Acheron. So if you want to pair up Feixiao with Acheron, we are going to be running Acheron with a speed boots, but if you are going to be running Acheron with either Bronya or Sparkle, you're going to be running Acheron with a attack boost, right? So generally speaking, the builds are going to differ a little bit slightly, depending if you're going to be running E2 Bronya or Sparkle versus Sunday, right? So the performance are going to be as follows. For a E0S1 Acheron with a E0S1 Sunday versus E0S1 Sparkle versus E2S1 Bronya, then this is going to be E0S1 Jiao as well as Adventuring with Japart Signature Light Cone. This is going to be the finding. E0S1 Sparkle is going to give a roughly 4.34% higher total damage increase compared to E0S1 Sunday. And then E0S1 Sunday slightly outperforms E2S1 Bronya by less than 2% according to this sheet value over here. Now keep in mind, this is also because we have some overflow damage, especially against the target, in this case going to be the True Swarm, for all of the summons, right? So not too big of a difference. I would say the overall differential between Sparkle, Bronya, and Sunday, it is going to be very minimal as long as you can secure your Jiao as well as Adventuring with the respective signature light codes, right? If you want to add this with a E2S1 Acheron, so that's when you are no longer bound by the lack of the nihility multiplier. In this specific scenario, almost all of them are performing at the same caliber. E0S1 Sunday, E0S1 Sparkle, and E2S1 Bronya, they are essentially the same, with less than 1% difference between all three. So at this point of the video, like I mentioned just now at the summary, if you're considering of pulling for Sunday, you shouldn't be thinking of pulling for Sunday just for like a Feixiao upgrade or an Acheron upgrade, right? He is really just meant for summon DPS like Jing Yuan, summon DPS in the future like Aglaia, or just preparing yourself for what version 3 has to offer. If you want to strengthen your current version 2 DPS setup like either Feixiao or Acheron, you wouldn't find too much of a differential comparing Sunday with any of our current hypercarry supports, right? So that is going to be the finding for Acheron as well as a little bit on Feixiao. And now let's just talk a little bit more about Jingliu. So like I mentioned at the start of the video as well, the problem with Jingliu is that although she does gain quite a lot from the energy recharge, the full 100% buff coverage, which is something that Bronya always had problem facing, her biggest problem is the crit rate. So for Jingliu, it is very easy for her to overstack on crit rate. So this additional crit rate from Sunday is essentially almost going to be useless on Jingliu if you were to run her with the brand new 4-piece set, or if you go for crit damage shares and try to aim as little crit as possible, you are still most likely going to find yourself with some kind of overflow with Jingliu. So you can see from the performance over here, the differential is going to be as follows. With a E0S1 Jingliu plus a E0S1 Sunday versus a E2S1 Bronya, Sunday is still going to be giving us a roughly 14% final damage increase compared to a E2S1 Bronya. The main reason for this is going to be due to the 20% energy regeneration. So discounting the crit rate, discounting the buff coverage, the 20% energy is really what makes Sunday a lot more suitable for Jingliu, because it allows Jingliu to basically potentially stay in her spectral transmigration state for 1 turn more, which can be the differential between clearing in 2 cycles or 3 cycles. Because the moment Jingliu comes out of that stage, it will be very bad. And this is also, of course, with the benefit of Robin as well as Huo, because this 3 different supports with Sunday, Robin, Huo, they just synergize so perfectly with one another, especially Huo with Sunday, that E2S1 Bronya will definitely fall behind if you were to compare her with another DPS, right? So that's gonna be that. Now, one last DPS I kind of want to mention right now, aside from Jing Yuan, Acheron, everybody, is going to be our Imbibitor Lunae. So Sunday has considerable upgrades for Imbibitor Lunae, especially if you have a E2 Imbibitor Lunae, because previously Sparkle's buff essentially only lasted 1 turn. So if you were to use E2 Imbibitor Lunae, after Sparkle pulls up Dale, the moment Dale casts his ultimate and then casts his enhanced base attack again, his ultimate and enhanced skill, they are gonna run out of Sparkle's skill buff. That is gonna be a problem because it will lead to a lower buff coverage, which means that they might not be that synergistic aside from the additional skill points. But now that we have Sunday, because I've mentioned Sunday is technically even more skill point positive for Sparkle, and the fact that the buff coverage goes up to 100% on top of the additional 20% energy max regeneration, it means that our E2 Dale's rotation, buff coverage, uptime is gonna be a lot more comfortable and a lot higher compared to a Sparkle. Now this is of course assuming that they are both on a 3-turn outward rotation, right? So the benefit for E2S1 Imbibitor Lunae, he is actually one of the highest beneficiaries compared to even Jing Yuan. So under this specific setup with Sunday, E2 Dale, Robin, as well as Huan, E2 deals personal damage against a single target is gonna go up to 880,000, which is gonna be essentially on the same level as a version 2 DPS like Acheron or even Feixiao itself, right? But this is specifically for a E2 Imbibitor Lunae. Keep in mind, this team is also extremely high investment because you do need a E0 S1 Sunday with an E0 S1 Robin to ensure the ultimate coverage, because otherwise you are going to be running out of Robin's ultimate very, very quickly, right? And also on top of that, if you can have, also get E2 Imbibitor Lunae signature icon. So this is a very, very costly team, which you need 8 different 5-star units or a signature icon, right? So something for you guys to consider, but also an extremely potent team comp, and I'm definitely going to be trying this out on the test server myself. And with that, we have come to the end of Sunday's CN unit analysis. Let me know what you guys think of him below. Where do you pull for him? How have you guys playing with him? What is his best DPS, etc, etc. So word of the day is gonna be Hail Sunday. Join Twitch, join YouTube, join Discord, join Twitter, all the best. But guys, I'll see you guys next time. Take care.